So, I will be talking about notes from the Bad Bug book released by the CDC. This recording will cover gram-negative bacteria, and it's part one of two. So, we'll be talking about Salmonella, Campylobacter jejuni, Yersinia enterocolitica, Shigella, Vibrio parahemolyticus, and Coxiella burnetii. So, what's gram-negative and gram-positive? So, the main difference is within the cell walls. Gram-negative bacteria have a thin peptidoglycan cell wall with an exterior membrane of liposaccharides. It's harder to treat because they are more resistant to antibiotics and they're worse for us generally. So it's membrane wall than inner membrane for gram-negative. Gram-positive bacteria don't have outer membranes, but instead they have thick peptidoglycan walls, thicker walls than gram-negatives. These thick walls absorb antibiotics more readily. So gram-positive just have the very thick walls, whereas gram-negative have membrane, wall, and then inner membrane. So Salmonella. Salmonella causes two kinds of illnesses. The first one being gastrointestinal illness, and the second one being typhoidal illness. Gastrointestinal illness produces nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, cramps, and fever. Lasts a couple of days, usually self-limiting, and can lead to arthritis. And it's commonly associated in foods such as meats, eggs, fruits, and vegetables. Typhoidal illness produces a high fever, diarrhea, constipations, aches, and lethargy. 10% of people can die without treatment, and it's usually associated with sewage water and contaminated water, and it can get into crops. Some pets can also carry and spread salmonella to anything that it comes into contact with, specifically turtles, reptiles, and chicks. If pet owners don't wash their hands, they can contaminate food or themselves with salmonella. People with weakened immune systems can get salmonella infection that can spread to their other organs. So again, Salmonella the bacteria, it's a gram-negative bacteria that can't move and doesn't form spores. It's divided into two main species that cause illness. The first one being Salmonella enterica, the second one being Salmonella bongori. So enterica, Salmonella enterica is the one with the greatest public health concern, as it has 6 subspecies: Salmonella enterica, Enterica salome, Enterica arizonae. I don't think they're too important to know, but based on the serotype or the group of bacteria, Salmonella can cause non-typhoidal illness, so the gastrointestinal illness, or typhoid fever, the typhoid illness, which is associated with sewage. So non-typhoidal salmonellosis occurs with all serotypes other than Salmonella typhi or Salmonella paratyphi. It causes a low mortality rate. The onset takes hours, so 6 to 72 hours after exposure. Symptoms include nausea, vomiting, abdominal cramps, diarrhea, fever, and headaches. Can last up to 7 days and can lead to dehydration, reactive arthritis, and blood infection. We usually get it through eating contaminated food. Next, we have typhoid fever causing salmonella, and this is caused by Salmonella typhi and Salmonella paratyphi, and these bacteria can only be found in humans. It has a high mortality rate if untreated, and can take weeks to onset. Symptoms include high fever, lethargy, gastrointestinal symptoms. Complications include septicemia and heart infections and septic arthritis. Its route of entry is through our mouths, through fecally contaminated stuff that we consume. So Salmonella is ubiquitous in nature and can colonize GI tracts of livestock, wildlife, pets, and humans. Can also be found in pond water sediment and is usually spread fecal orally and through water. Protozoa or parasites can act as reservoirs for salmonella too. Salmonella can be spread through meats, farm irrigated produce with contaminated water, soils, and insects, as well as factory equipment, food handler hands, kitchen surfaces, and utensils. Salmonella typhi and paratyphi are only found in humans, usually found in drinking water and irrigation water contaminated with sewage and human feces. It's highly recommended that only potable water be used to cook vegetables and be consumed in areas where these organisms are endemic. So places that are endemic with typhi and paratyphi salmonella have a high risk of having the bacteria in produce that's washed by contaminated water. Other outbreaks can be associated with handling certain animals and pets, such as turtles, frogs, and tricks. So food sources traditionally is thought to come from animals in the past, but now produce contaminated with contaminated water during irrigation or washing is also now a major source of outbreaks. Salmonella can survive on low moisture foods like spices. These can be vehicles for large outbreaks. So vehicle being an indirect transmission, usually something inanimate like spices. It's also linked to poultry, eggs, milk, and dairy products. Dressings with unpasteurized eggs, toppings with raw eggs, peanut butter, and produce can also have salmonella. Salmonella is usually spread through cross-contamination of food or food handlers to other food or objects in the environment. For example, raw meat, poultry, fish not kept separated from each other during preparation or cooking, as well as food handler hands or surfaces not being properly cleaned when coming into contact with these ingredients. Handling pets or wildlife like turtles or frogs, or handling water or soil can lead to cross-contamination in food. So if we handle these things, then handle the food without properly washing our hands, we can transmit salmonella to the food. There's been links to culinary frog legs for consumption and salmonella outbreaks. We diagnose salmonella by isolating it in the stool and target populations, so anybody can get infected with salmonella, but it's a lot more riskier for vulnerable populations, such as people with HIV, immunocompromised people, kids, elderly, cancer patients. So HIV patients are 20 times more vulnerable to salmonellosis. So Campylobacter jejuni, it's the third leading cause of foodborne illness in the US. Symptoms usually last 2 to 10 days, and diarrhea, sometimes bloody, is produced, and vomiting and cramping, but usually go away. Major sources of Campylobacter jejuni include raw poultry, unpasteurized milk and cheeses, unchlorinated and contaminated water, and it can be found in meats and seafoods and vegetables. It can infect anyone, but children are more likely to get infections. Infants have the highest rate of illness. People with weakened immune systems are at higher risk, so 40 times higher. So unborn babies can get infections from their mothers, and it's usually rare, but it can cause miscarriages. So Campylobacter jejuni, the bacteria, is a non-spore-forming gram-negative bacteria that is mobile. It can grow in low oxygen environments. Most can grow at oxygen concentrations between 3 to 5%. These bacteria are fragile in ambient temperatures and environment and are difficult to culture in laboratories. Campylobacter jejuni is susceptible to drying, freezing, heating, disinfectants, and acidic conditions. There's also other species of Campylobacter that include Campylobacter coli and Campylobacter fetus that can also cause foodborne illness, but the most are caused by Campylobacter jejuni. Infections with these other species are similar. Campylobacter fetus is associated with animal contact or contaminated food and is very problematic for fetuses. So the most notable complication for Campylobacteria is Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is an autoimmune disorder. Because Campylobacter jejuni antigen receptors are similar to the ones on our nervous system tissues, our immune system will attack our nervous system. It can also lead to reactive arthritis and hemolytic uremic syndrome. It's usually comes from improperly or undercooked poultry, but it can also be associated with unpasteurized milk and cheeses and contaminated water. We can prevent transmission of Campylobacter jejuni to avoid cross-contamination from raw meats or poultries, thorough cooking, pasteurization, water disinfection. Campylobacter is also part of our natural gut microflora. Sorry, not ours, but animal microflora. And animals such as chickens, swine, and cattle can carry a lot of cells. The risk for mishandled fresh or processed poultry during prep, or if it's undercooked, is a source of Campylobacter. Can also be found on vegetables and seafood, and found in non-chlorinated water. So kids under 5 and young adults and older populations are commonly infected with Campylobacter. It's very high in infants, and it can also affect pregnant women and can lead to fetal infections or miscarriages. People with HIV or AIDS are 40 times more likely to get it. Yersinia enterocolitica. So food contaminated with Yersinia can make people sick. Yersinia is commonly associated with pork, especially chitlins, which are popular in the South, and it uses pork intestinal products. It's also associated with unpasteurized milk and oysters. Infection passes from our hands into our mouths. People not washing their hands properly. Young children mainly get it, can cause high fever, stomach pains, and it's usually self-limiting. So Yersinia, the bacteria, has 11 species and 4 are pathogenic. The following cause gastroenteritis, so foodborne illness: Yersinia enterocolitica and Yersinia pseudotuberculosis. Yersinia is a gram-negative bacteria that is not part of the human gut flora, and they're transmitted fecal-orally. Gastroenteritis causing species have been found in animals such as pigs, birds, beavers, cats, and dogs. Yersinia enterocolitica can be found in frogs, flies, fleas, and environmental sources such as lakes and ponds as well. So Yersinia is a psychotrophic bacteria, meaning it grows well in low temperatures and can grow at temperatures below 4 Celsius. It can withstand freezing and stay on frozen food for extended periods of time. It survives better in cold temperatures, and it persists longer on raw foods because they have more nutrients. They can grow easier at refrigeration temperatures in vacuum-packed meat, boiled eggs, fish, liquid eggs, and tofu. Yersinia can grow at the pH range between 4 and 10. It's weak against acidic environments. It's important to note that Yersinia enterocolitica and pseudotuberculosis cause foodborne illness, whereas Yersinia pestis causes the plague, and it's similar to Yersinia pseudotuberculosis. So yersiniosis, fatality is usually rare. It's caused by enterocolitica and pseudotuberculosis, can lead to reactive arthritis. It's usually self-limiting and will last days to 3 weeks. And it enters through us fecal-orally. And again, I think the most notable thing about Yersinia enterocolitica is that it's psychotrophic, meaning it grows well in cold temperatures. So sources of Yersinia, usually found in meats, oysters, fish, crabs, and raw milk, found in soil and animals. Poor sanitation and proper food handling can be a source of contamination, and diarrhea occurs in 80% of cases. Diagnosing Yersinia enterocolitica or yersiniosis is very similar to Crohn's disease and appendicitis, and we diagnose it through stool isolation. Very young, debilitated, very old, and immunocompromised people are very at risk at contracting this. Shigella is a species of bacteria that spreads through contaminated feces and is spread through unclean water, so pool water, rec water, or drinking water. Food can become contaminated if it's handled by someone who is sick or doesn't properly wash their hands after a bowel movement. It can also contaminate fruits and vegetables. Symptoms are often mild and self-limiting, but can become serious and cause dysentery, which leads to large amounts of diarrhea that can lead to fluid loss and eventually lead to death. It can be treated by antibiotics, but people with weak immune systems, the elderly and young, are at more of a risk. And it's important to know that cooking kills Shigella. Shigella is a gram-negative bacteria that doesn't move or form spores. Some Shigella species produce toxins, and Shigella species include Shigella sone, Shigella boydii, Shigella flexneri, Shigella dysentery. Some strains produce enterotoxins and Shiga toxin. Humans are the only hosts, but it can also be found on primates too. It's usually found in water contaminated with human feces. Shigella is very sensitive to environmental conditions and doesn't survive pasteurization or cooking. Shigella is very fastidious, meaning it has low requirements for growth and it's easy to culture in labs. It can survive on foods with low pH, so fresh fruits and vegetables, and it can survive in vacuumed food and in water. Shigellosis, or the infection caused by Shigella, can also be called bacillary dysentery, and it causes diarrhea that is watery, and again, it can lead to dehydration and death. All Shigella species can cause diarrhea and spread, especially in crowded and unsanitary conditions. Shigella dysentery causes the most severe disease. Shigella sone produces the mildest form of shigellosis. Boydii and flexneri are mild but can be severe, noting that flexneri is usually found in developing countries, and sone, the mildest form, is found in developed countries. It's important to note that onset of shigellosis is hours, so 8 to 50 hours. It can lead to death from dehydration, hemolytic uremic syndrome, and reactive arthritis. Symptoms include cramps and diarrhea, bloody stool. Those are the most notable ones. Can last up to a week, the illness, and the route of entry is through our mouths when we consume something infected with feces or contaminated with feces. So its source mainly comes from fecally contaminated food or water, and it's primarily food from poor hygiene or consumption of raw foods like salads. Vibrio parahemolyticus. It's important to note that there are different kinds of Vibrio bacteria that can cause illness when contaminated seafood is eaten. So parahemolyticus is associated with oysters, but can contaminate fish and shellfish, and it does not cause cholera. Parahemolyticus can cause bloody diarrhea and other gastrointestinal symptoms, but they're usually mild and last less than a week. People at risk are diabetics, people with liver disease, and kidney disease. Parahemolyticus is found in oceans and estuaries and can cause illness when contaminated water comes into contact with drinking water or seafood that has been living on it. Can be killed by cooking, and the bacteria can contaminate and get you sick at any time of the year. So Vibrio parahemolyticus, the bacteria, it's a gram-negative bacteria from estuary and ocean environments and in tropical temperate coastal areas worldwide. It has pathogenic and non-pathogenic forms. In the environment, Vibrio parahemolyticus is usually non-pathogenic. It can grow between 20 to 35 Celsius, and it can withstand temperatures up to 41 Celsius. It can grow in salty environments and is immediately killed off in fresh water, meaning it can't be transmitted via fecal-oral route. It's usually transmitted through contaminated food. It's weak against low pH, so acidic environments, freezing, and cooking. Onset of symptoms takes 4 to 90 hours, and complications include septicemia. Route of entry is through contaminated food. So, Vibrio parahemolyticus has a compound that attacks red blood cells and intestinal cells that can disrupt electrolyte balance. And there are usually more infections in the warmer months, and deaths are rare. It's mainly from consumption of raw and improperly cooked oysters and seafoods, more frequent in Asian countries, and more frequent and improper refrigeration can allow for proliferation of this bacteria. Coxiella burnetii. This bacteria causes Q fever, which has 2 forms. Some people don't show symptoms. In one form, symptoms go away and are not serious, and antibiotics aren't required. And another form of infection is chronic and can form and can lead to death if untreated, usually in people with underlying conditions or pregnant women. Q fever may not develop until 6 weeks or years after infection and can spread to brain, liver, or lungs. People can become infected through airborne particles from, for example, slaughterhouses, consuming unpasteurized products. It's important to ensure products are pasteurized to prevent Coxiella burnetii from being transmitted. So Coxiella burnetii is a gram-negative bacteria that causes Q fever. Coxiella can survive in harsh physical conditions such as heat and low and high pH. Can survive for long periods of time in the environment, can be disseminated via aerosols, and has a low infective dose. The CDC classifies Coxiella burnetii as a bioterrorism agent as well. It is the most heat-resistant, non-spore-forming pathogen found in milk, and is usually a benchmark in proper pasteurization. So Q fever, caused by Coxiella burnetii, was initially associated with Australian slaughterhouses in the 1930s and is commonly associated now with zoonosis and livestock handling occupations. The disease has 2 forms, acute and chronic. Acute may or may not be symptomatic and is generally less serious, but has potentials for complications, whereas chronic forms are less common but very severe and have high mortality rates. So complications from acute Q fever, it takes 2 weeks for its onset. Usually asymptomatic, but can lead to pneumonia or high fevers. Can be inhaled as aerosolized bacteria, ingested through unpasteurized milks, and tick bites can transmit it too. Chronic Q fever has a high mortality rate if it's untreated. Takes 6 weeks to years for it to manifest. It can cause endocarditis, and it's curable, but patients have to get treatment less than 8. It's curable, but antibiotic regimens are long, and people are prone to relapses. So sources of this bacteria, Coxiella burnetii, it's found worldwide and can be excreted through urine, milk, feces, and other birth products. And it can infect humans, cattle, sheep, goats, reptiles, birds, and ticks. It's difficult to diagnose because it mimics many diseases, and target populations are people who work in animal husbandry and are exposed to aerosolized livestock birth products, and women, because if they get it, they can miscarry, Usually people 45 to 50 years old can get this bacteria. And that concludes part 1 of gram-negative bacterias listed in the Bad Bug book, released by the CDC.